Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between. The concept of sacred geometry is something that I have been fascinated with for a long time, but never truly understood exactly what it meant and what in nature is sacred geometry, because it shows up in so many places and is really interesting to think about how nature really produces sort of these perfect images, these perfect geometrical shapes in so many of the things that we see. And so when I came across Gail and Gregory Hoag's book, Sacred Geometry, The Universal Language of Divine Alignment, I felt like I needed to have them on. I am so interested in this topic and really just captivated by how sacred geometry works, what it means about the universe and how things are in alignment or not in alignment. And in this episode with Gail and Gregory, we dive into some of the technologies and discoveries that they have used using concepts of sacred geometry to transform the lives of people across the world. They are speakers and teachers talking about the universal patterns displayed in sacred geometry and what it means about our consciousness. So if you've been curious about sacred geometry, you won't want to miss this episode. Welcome, Gregory and Gail, to Life, Death, and the Space Between.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having us, Amy. It's wonderful to be here.
So this is such an exciting topic for me, and I feel like this conversation could go on for hours. And I read the book and was just engrossed in the density of it, and I'm excited to have not density in a bad way, just the nuances of sacred geometry, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Not to be confused with the geometry you took in high school, but there are pieces of it. So let's get started with what is sacred geometry and how you came to this work.
So I'll start out with sort of the broad overview, and then we can kind of drill down more into it as we get going. But basically, everything starts out as just pure energy, formless energy. And then that energy moves into this physical density, this physical dimension. Well, it needs to have a very particular pathway to do that. And sacred geometry shows us how that works. So in other words, there are very specific rhythms and patterns and cycles and all kinds of things that we can see in nature around us, in our own bodies, the way that we're formed. Everything is very predictable. So as much as it looks like we're living in this very chaotic universe, it's really so precisely organized. And sacred geometry is the way that all happens. And the ancients understood that. They recognized that there are very important ways that they could build their sacred sites or their whatever, whether it's a cathedral or a sanctuary, whatever it is, they would build it in certain ways so that people would feel as if they could ascend to the higher levels, the higher levels of who they are. Because, as human beings, we are more than what just represents us in this physical life. And sacred geometry really addresses all that beautifully.
And is the piece that makes it sacred that it's just almost so perfect, like that everything seems to be perfectly laid out in a way that makes mathematical sense?
Well, that's one way that you can look at it. However, another way that you can look at it, and I know Gregory wants to answer this too, is that there is the sacred element is that it connects us to who we are at that higher sacred level, the level of soul. And so that's, it's sort of a multifaceted kind of thing. So From here, I'm going to toss it over to Gregory, who's
By the way, if you see me looking down, it's because I'm taking notes here to ask more questions. So,
well, when we talk about the way 99.9999% of everything is pure energy, and it comes into physical matter, we can actually measure it in many different ways and see how it follows particular archetypes. And when we bring those archetypes, the way physical, say anything organic grows, the way the DNA molecule grows, all these kinds of things, and we bring a representation of that into the physical dimension and duplicate it, we can create something like an antenna system. And when that geometry is modeling the way universe works and is capable, because of its structure, because of the materials it uses, etc., it's capable of transferring energy. That's what, to me, really makes it sacred, because then it has the ability to transport us into another realm of feeling, existence, understanding. And you might think of it also in the way that, for example, I suggest maybe you picture driving into a big box store, getting out of your car in the parking lot and sitting on the curb and taking a deep breath as you look around. And then what is that feeling compared to going into nature, sitting under a tree next to a stream where the birds are singing, the wind is blowing, you have the negative ions from the water and the tree and the oxygen pouring into your system. What you're feeling is something that's totally natural. And it's all natural order. It's the way everything is meant to be. The first example is working with the cement and the rebar and the artificial elements, the electromagnetic frequencies, the car exhaust, and all those things that literally separate us, disconnect us from the bigger part of ourselves, because we're much more than this little human being that we all relate to. I mean, we're literally like the tip of the iceberg. If you read our book, we use that example a number of times to explain that this reality that we relate to as human beings is a very, very tiny perspective of the totality of who we are. And when we work with the geometry of nature, the geometry of creation, and the way the sun, the moon, the earth dance together, and those patterns, when we bring those patterns into our daily lives, it can start to shift our internal pattern, our internal connection. And to me, that's what really makes it sacred.
Can you give me some concrete examples? I think when I think of sacred geometry, I think of, hang on, let me look up the name of this because you reference it, the Leonardo da Vinci, the Vitruvian Man, and that picture. That's sort of like when I think of sacred geometry, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. So I'm glad that you mentioned it in the book. What is it about that picture, about the human body that depicts sacred geometry? I want to sort of bring this down to tangible, I guess, bring it from the 5D, as you would say, to the 3D, bring it from like the thought to the kind of physical level, so I can really understand, and my listeners can really understand how this exactly manifests in our physical world.
All right. What I am going to do is I have some images from our book, and since this is going to be on video, your viewers can also see it. So here is the Vitruvian Man drawn by Leonardo da Vinci that you were referencing. And what he's working with are particular proportions in the way the outstretched arms, the head to the navel to the feet. And if we break that down into a modern human being, very good looking guy, human being.
He's very svelte and ripped, this
Yeah,
guy that you're showing me.
yeah. And yet he is the standard for all of us, you know, as far as
Not
the
most
proportions.
Americans, that's for sure.
Yeah. At any rate, the proportions. And that's
Okay,
what we're
okay.
talking about. You see, if you take his hand to his wrist and then the wrist to the elbow, divide one length into the other, the A into the B, you're going to get a particular number, a ratio called 1.618. It goes dot, dot, dot. That means it never ends. It doesn't resolve. It's one of those ratios that just keeps going. They call it irrational, indeterminate. But in geometry, we can look at it. We can see it. And that's what's happening with his hand to his elbow, his head to his navel, to his feet, and the navel to the groin area, to the knees is another one of those perspectives. This is found throughout nature. And
so that this equation is always the same and it always works out perfectly in that way? Is that?
it does. It's like, here is
God,
a
you have
caliper.
all the tools for this. Have you done this before?
Yesterday,
fact.
as a matter of fact. So this is a phi ratio caliper. The small part is in relationship to the large part in that number I talked about. So if I look at my first digit of my middle finger to the whole finger, it's in that proportion. And my
Oh my gosh.
finger to my wrist is in that proportion. And my hand to my elbow is in that proportion. My head to my navel, to my feet, it all starts working out like that. And even our DNA follows these proportions. And when I go into the plant and animal kingdom, which is what we're seeing here, you can see a nautilus shell follows those proportions, forming this spiral. And just to let you know, if we didn't stop growing at a certain point, we would start spiraling around like this too, which would look very, very strange. But in the world where plants can keep growing, then you have things like the sunflower face that forms that particular spiral, and broccoli, and so on. So what we're talking about is, this is one of many archetypes that universe works with. And there are other ratios that plants grow by. I mean, the square root of 3 is often a display of how flowers put out their petals. And so there are other square roots, other dimensions, but the universe doesn't mess up on this. It keeps following these patterns. And there is certainly a sense of free will in this dimension where every flower is a little different. Every human being is a little different. We can tell one from another. You look like Amy today and I look like Gregory. Hopefully tomorrow too. And the thing is, though, that proportionately, and the way we're constructed with internally and our DNA to our organs, they follow these patterns and relationships. And when we bring those patterns and relationships into a codified model, like the geometries sitting next to me that are perfections of these geometries, because this bottom geometry, it's working with the phi ratio again. However, it's also working with some elements that, if we want to go back to some of our images, it's working with some elements that we relate to in terms of the Platonic solids. So these are geometries that we might have learned in school. And when you take the number of degrees on their surfaces and add them up, you end up with the diameter of the sun with one set. A different group gives us the exact diameter of the earth in miles. When we take that number, translate it from degrees into miles, we then get the diameter of the earth, and the diameter of the moon equals the number of degrees on the face of a cube.
Okay.
And then
I am no math person, but this seems crazy to me. How did people figure this out? Like, how did they think to start putting these numbers together to try to understand all of this?
Well, you see, that's why we wrote our book, because some of these I've never seen anywhere before, but because of the way we got into sacred geometry through higher connection and getting downloads of information, we started seeing these patterns and creating relationships. So here it's the diameter of the moon plus the diameter of the earth gives us the same number of degrees as this geometry next to me. And that's the geometry that I can also show you more if you wish, works with the same phi ratio relationships. So this geometry in our environment, when it's spinning at a particular speed, because revolutions work with time, just like the revolutions of the earth and the revolution of our moon around us and the earth around the sun in 365 days. Time also has geometries. Light has geometries. And a lot of the information we put in our book, it's not collected from what we've seen before, but it's brand new in terms of this is how the universe relates. Shouldn't we be dancing in the same way as universe if we want to be part of all that is?
So what is it, Gail, I'll ask you. So what does that then mean? Just trying to share the love here a little bit. What does that mean then exactly in terms of, like, how does this then get applied in our lives? It's fascinating, but
So
then what?
It's a great question. And the first thing to know is that we've been working with this in a way that is not just a mental way. In fact, when we first got together, Gregory and I, he had this box of these different geometries. And I've always been very intuitive. And I was also working with a lot of spiritual work and doing channeling and things like that. And I had been fascinated with the work of Buckminster Fuller. So I had a little bit of a background in geometry because of that. And that was quite different than what I learned in school. But so he had this box, and I put my hand over some of these edges of these different tetrahedrons, and I could feel the energy that was coming off of them. And when that happened, I realized there's something more going on with this. This isn't just some kind of a mental exercise. What can you do with this? Well, looking back historically, and again, when we go back and see how the ancients use this understanding, this knowledge, they wanted to use it to support the evolution of consciousness for people. And the way we also got into our study of sacred geometry was with some great masters like Keith Critchlow and John Michel. And the way they would start their programs was always working with meditation. We would enter in looking at this from that perspective of the sacred. So that really spoke to me deeply, because my work previously as an artist was creating paintings, and my intention was to create an environment for people to stand in front of, and they could go into it and they could connect with the greater creativity and spirituality of who they are. And so sacred geometry started showing us that that's what it has been used for historically, and that's where we could take it. So when you go out in nature and, maybe you've had a stressed out day, take a walk, go somewhere, you start breathing differently. You go to a beautiful place in nature, sit down by a stream, underneath some trees, and feel the wind blowing, and have the sound of birds and the trickle of the water that's in your environment. What happens is you start functioning differently. You start creating that resonance with everything that is around us, with how we're created. And we live in a world, this modern world that we live in, has often extracted this from our realm. So our job with what we do is to support ourselves, each other, to be able to evolve our consciousness and come back into gathering what this all is to be a part of our lives. So we took off with developing different geometries, different tools that support people to have those connections reestablished, because there's so much that distracts us from the essence of who we are. And we found that sacred geometry was the best vehicle that we could find that would help that reconnection get strongly reestablished.
So I want to shift a little bit to numbers, because this is fascinating for me and also falls in this geometry space. You talk a lot about numbers. Particularly, I'm curious how the numbers 1 and 2 help us understand divine masculine and divine feminine. And then also curious how other numbers create the structures of our reality.
Okay. And it's not that numbers help us create the reality, but numbers describe the reality as archetypes, as qualifiers. I mean, it's not that they're just quantities, but they have characters to them. And the very first number is 1, and that's unity. And unity is source. Unity is beginning. Unity is everything. And yet you see the way the number 1 plays itself out in this reality. If you divide anything by 1 or multiply by anything by 1, you get the same number again. 1 times 5 still looks like 5. So where's 1? It's like source in many ways is unknowable and hidden in this reality. And also, I talk about in the book that numbers have genders, actually. And the odd numbers are more masculine in nature. I mean, like 3 and 5, they all have points. 4, 2, I mean, they're all more balanced. And so the even numbers are a little more receptive and more feminine. So 2 is the number that proceeds from 1 when you think of 1 as a circle and then another circle coming out when it duplicates itself. As it starts to come out, that's where 2 is formed, a reflection of the first. And that's where the divine feminine is born, and what we call duality. And this reality is how we know what's going on, and it's all based on duality. And so, in a sense, in the biblical sense, the feminine got a bad rap for bringing us into the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of duality. But without duality, there would be no separation. We wouldn't have any way of distinguishing one from the other. There wouldn't be any way for energy to flow one to the other. You know, there are so many aspects that are really there with duality that are a gift. And so the knowledge of even higher understanding has been given to us through that feminine aspect of duality. And it's through the feminine aspect that we are opening up to more and more today, recognizing we need to have that balance in our society if we are going to progress spiritually. And this is the nature of 2. It is the doorway back into source. And so we must be comfortable with one to be comfortable with the other, to work with both of them so that we can expand our understanding. And all the sacred numbers that have harmonic resonance with each other, the way they work is only through 1 and 2.
What
And
do you
what
mean
I
the
mean
sacred
by
numbers? Yeah, that have harmonic resonance.
yeah, so if you have a number like 432, you add a 0 to it. Working with 1, that's like 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. It just adds zeros, but the number stays the same. So it really, you can see, it's almost like going back to the, the whole background of 1. It's just, that's why multiples, increasing the multitude of a number, the magnitude, I should say, it doesn't change the harmonic resonance. But 2, we've seen given to us by Pythagoras in the geometry of strings and music, that if you take a string and cut it in half, you jump up an octave, and you make it twice as long, you drop down an octave. And universe works in octaves, sets of 8. This playing field is an 8 by 8, 64 playing field. That's why you have that as the checkerboard or the chessboard, and why 64 codons. This is how the DNA is laid out, and the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching to help us divine a higher order. But bottom line, it's working with the multiples of 2. So we work with the numbers 3. That gets us into a whole other realm of all of creation. And then when you start doing multiples of 2, like 3 squared is 9 times 2 is 18, and that gives us 36, 72, 144, and you start seeing numbers that 36 and 72 are the sacred numbers of a triangle that gives us the phi ratio relationship, that starts working with this geometry, that works with the sun or the moon and the earth rather, and the way their diameters dance together. So you can just see how 1 and 2 and then all the numbers have ways of helping us understand creation. And when we break large numbers, composite numbers, down into their simple roots of 1 through 9, we can see from their root the nature of that number and how it works. And 5 works with life, and 6 works with order, and keeping the order of time and space very exact. And it's just mind-boggling how you see it work again and again and again. And it's so much, after a while, if it's coincidence, well, we should start dancing with coincidence because it happens more frequently than anything else.
And the nature of how this is created is just this universal energy, this source energy that has created what seems to be this perfectionistic way of the universe existing.
Well, it really does seem very perfect when you look at it from this perspective. And again, we live in a vibrational universe. We start out where everything is just energy. Even when we look at the molecular structure, it's mostly space. And yet what we tend to focus on is that very small amount of the actual physical structure. But there's all this other energy that's there. And, the reason that we started our book with talking about consciousness is because consciousness is the foundation of everything. And what we believe is that consciousness is love. And that's the foundation, the creative source that brings everything together. And, just like with whenever, like if you have a project and you decide, I want to, develop a place where people can feel safe to have conversations together, then you'll start looking at, well, what are all the different elements and how can we bring it together? Well, think about how that concept has to then come into very structured ways of organizing itself so that you can actually deliver what it is that you want. And so the consciousness of universe, or the consciousness of creation is behind all of this. And it enables us to get to very, very high levels of creation. I love looking around at all the different qualities of what's on this earth. There's such variation when you go from one climate to another, from, areas of mountains to plains, to water to arid conditions. You have this extraordinary variation, and yet it all is connected in the principles of how it is founded, how it's created. And so this consciousness that is at the bottom of all of this is extraordinary and exquisite, and can then go out and have such a palette of what it brings forth into physical creation. And yet it starts all with consciousness. And so here we are in this very amazing time where part of our mission is to evolve consciousness. And the more we do that, the more we will create this amazing variety of what it is that we're capable of. And that's, I think, what's so exciting, because many of us now are being called to evolve, to, really bring forth what humanity is capable of doing when it comes from a place of compassion and love and higher understanding. And sacred geometry is just a beautiful reflection of what is available to us that we can participate with.
Well, Gail, I actually think that's a beautiful place to end, because it just really seems to highlight everything that we're talking about and really what the goal of sacred geometry is. So if people want to learn more about your work, sacred geometry tools, can you let us know where they can do that?
Absolutely. And I think Greg's going to put up a slide here. We have a website, and it's iconnecttoall.com. The letter I, the word connect, the number 2, the word all.com. And if you add onto it /chapter, we're offering a free chapter of the first chapter of the book. That's what is consciousness. So we start with coming into that and looking at from that perspective. And honestly, one of the ways that I really wanted to do it that way was because that's how I got enrolled in sacred geometry, wanting to come forth with it into a place of conscious co-creation. And so we invite everyone to come to our website and take a look at that. And then from there, the website has all the different tools that we've been creating. You know, we've been doing this for close to 40 years. So we've done a lot of work and we've discovered a lot, and we've had tremendous experiences with people all over the world, tens of thousands of people. So you can take a look at what we've got there. And we also have lots of YouTube videos and meditations and all kinds of things that you'll find on our website.
All kinds of sacred geometric things. Well,
Yeah.
Gregory and Gail, thank you so much for your time today and for enlightening me to the nature of sacred geometry. Really fascinating to think about how the universe is laid out and how perfectly constructed it is. So thank you.
No, you're so welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.